Hi everyone. Now that we've taken a look at a lot of the different players that are in the ecosystem, all of the different types of the different animals that we've seen, looking at kingdom Animalia and whatnot like that, let's take a look at how these things interact with one another. That's what ecology is. So let's begin with the idea of what ecology is. This is the branch of biology that studies relationships between organisms and the environment. Between organisms, that would be the living part, and the environment, that would be the non living or abiotic part. So the environment. You have different factors that affect organisms during its lifetime. The biotic factors are all the living factors that affect an organism and the organisms itself. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we have the biotic part of the ecosystem, which are the living organisms, and then we have the abiotic part, which are the non-living part, which would be like your weather and your climate and your geology and such. So when we're talking about ecology, we talk about an organism. Organism would be just one organism of a particular species. When we talk about a population, we're talking about all of the organisms for that particular species, but a population is simply one species. Okay, so like for instance, we might have one alligator, but then we talk about the population of alligators. But when we talk about population of alligator, the population for alligators, we're not talking about anything else, just the population of alligators. We can talk about all of the populations within a particular ecosystem. Now we're talking about the community. So communities would be the biotic, B-I-O-T-I-C, the biotic part, the living part of an ecosystem. Within all of those living things, each thing has a niche or a niche, if you want to sound bougie. But the niche for a particular organism would be its job in an ecosystem. So you think about it, a good way to think about it would be its job. Now put together all of the communities together with the abiotic part, and now we have an ecosystem. Okay, and this would be climate, weather, which is the short term, and then climate the longer term, but also the water and the geology. Do you have mountains and streams or hills and valleys? What's there that's non-living? The type of rock. All of that together would be the ecosystem. So an ecosystem is the living part, all of the communities, together with the abiotic part, the non-living part, which is how much energy is available in an ecosystem, the climate, the weather, the minerals, the quality of the air, the pH or the salinity of the soil. Or the water, the weather, which is the short-term precipitation and temperature, the climate, which is the long-term patterns in precipitation and temperature. Those things are the abiotic part. So the interaction between the biotic and the abiotic together give us the ecosystem. So we talked about natural selection and adaptation earlier. Now, remember, when we're talking about adaptation from a natural selection point of view or an evolutionary standpoint, we're not talking about, for instance, if I moved to Alberta, Canada, I might get used to the fact that it's colder, but I'm not gonna like grow fur all over my body to protect myself from the cold. But when you have animals that live in cold environments, you're going to have animals that have genetic mutations that are giving them more fur or less fur. Well, those that have the ability to protect themselves better from the climate, those are going to be the ones with the biggest advantage, and so those will put their genes in the next generation. And so over time, all of the members of that population have that particular trait, and that would be an adaptation. Environments are in a constant state of change. So this puts stress on plants and animals in that particular ecosystem. And so plants and animals have to adapt in order to keep up with the changing environment. They will either have to, as they adapt, it doesn't mean that they're all sitting around going, oh, I've got to develop this. No, genetic genetic mutation is random. Natural selection, however, is not random. Um, as you have some genetic mutations that give a selective advantage, and if you go back and look at the lecture on natural selection again if this doesn't make sense. But there are always going to be those organisms within a population that have a random genetic mutation that is going to give them an advantage in a particular environment. Those that have an advantage are going to be the ones who will be able to live longer, find more mates, put more genes in the next generation, and so the whole population over time ends up with these traits that give a selective advantage. And so the population adapts to a particular environment. So when we talk about a population adapting to an environment, this is what we mean. And that is non-random, okay, non-random selection. And it's also, when we loosely refer to it, survival of the fittest. Those that are more fit, and remember the definition of fit is putting more offspring in the next generation. That's, from a biological standpoint, that would be the most fit. So those that are best fit for a particular environment are going to put more genes in the next generation, and so the whole population moves into that area. When we talk about dispersal in an ecosystem, we're talking about when the environmental conditions are good in a particular area, a population can disperse outward and continue to fill that particular area. But when you have more organisms in a particular area, you're going to end up with possibly competition for food, shelter, air, space, mates. Okay, when you have competition for mates in a particular ecosystem, that's definitely going to be a driving factor. Remember that whole sexual selection thing that we talked about in the natural selection? Some species can adapt to a particular area by using an alternate resource. Our own evolutionary ancestors, early humans, were able to do this. Because of the fact that we are generalists, we can change to a different food supply if one's food supply is no longer there. We have the ability to do that. And so this is an advantage for our particular species, and has been an advantage for several of our predecessor species of humans. Whereas those forms of humans who could not do that went extinct, where we were able to adapt. Some will go to different environments and look for different food sources. Some will things will either have to disperse to a different area, or they will have to change. The population will have to change, or they will simply go extinct, which happens over and over again. 99.9% of all species that have existed on Earth have gone extinct. So extinction is an inevitability with most things. Succession. When we're talking about an ecosystem, we have two different forms of succession. We have primary succession and secondary succession. So for primary succession, let's think about what happens whenever you have like a volcanic island. Okay, so a volcano erupts and you end up with barren rock sticking up out of the water. Well, over time, you're going to get some erosion of that rock, and you're going to get small types of things like lichens, which it's a symbiotic relationship between a plant and a fungus, will start to grow on the rock, and it will start to break down the rock. And so you'll have then small plants, the non-vascular plants, and then you'll start to have shrubs, and then you'll have small trees, and then you'll have softwood trees, and then you have hardwood trees, so that you get this ecosystem developing here. If we start with bare rock, that is referred to as primary succession. Starting from bare rock is referred to as primary succession. Now, different story. Suppose you have a forest fire that wipes out a particular area. Well, forest fires don't burn the soil. You may burn everything else, but it doesn't wipe the soil away and leaving bedrock. So you still have dirt there. If you still have dirt, you still have the soil, that's then you end up with a similar succession, small plants, bigger plants, etc., etc. That's called secondary succession. So starting from bare rock, primary succession. Starting from soil, that's secondary succession. Within ecosystems, organisms, the different populations will interact with one another. You may have predation, where one organism literally is going to hunt another organism. So that's predation. You may have competition where two organisms compete for space, food items. If they're the same population, they may be competing for mates. But they're competing for some sort of a resource. So two different populations will be competing for resources. So you may have predation, that's an interaction between two populations. You may have competition, that's an interaction between two populations. Or you may have some type of symbiosis. There are three major types of symbiosis. Okay, there is another type, but we're not going to talk about that here. Parasitism, that's where one organism benefits and the other organism is harmed. That's parasitism, typically like a leech. So one organism is benefited and the other organism is harmed. So the host is harmed and the parasite is benefited. Commensalism is when one organism is benefiting and it neither harms nor benefits the other one. And this is called commensalism. Okay, so one is benefiting and the other is neither benefiting nor is being harmed. And this is called commensalism. And then the final of the three major types of symbiosis is something called mutualism. And that's where both organisms benefit. Like for instance, algae and coral. That is a symbiotic relationship where both are benefiting. Where the symbiont algae provides nutrient for the coral provides space for the algae, etc. And so really some of the distinctions between some of these are a little magical, hand wavy. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. It's not as cut and dry as it kind of sounds right here on the screen, because some of these relationships are a little they're changeable, and so it's not quite as cut and dry as it sounds here. But in general, we have parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism, and it depends on if anything, something is benefiting from all of them, otherwise the relationship wouldn't exist. But is the host being harmed? Is the host not harmed or benefited? Or is the host being benefited? If they're both benefiting, mutualism. If one is neither benefited nor harmed, that's commensalism. And if the host is being harmed, we refer to that as parasitism. So roles in an ecosystem. So within an ecosystem, we have producers, which are all of those things that are autotrophic. Okay, things like green plants. This is always going to form the base of all ecosystems. Then we have consumers. Consumers in an ecosystem are found in different levels, and we call these levels trophic levels. You have primary consumers, which are the things that eat the producers. You have secondary consumers, which are those things that will eat the primary consumers. Then you have tertiary consumers that will eat the secondary consumers. And typically most things within an ecosystem can eat more than one thing, and like if you have something that can eat primary consumers and secondary consumers, we refer to that as an omnivore because it's eating plants and animals. So you have different trophic levels depending on what is being eaten. And we'll see more about that shortly. You have scavengers that eat dead organisms, and then you have decomposers, things like fungi, bacteria, that break down organic matter into its key components and put that back into the environment. So here are the roles in an ecosystem. If we take a look at each one of these roles, we have producers, consumers, and within the consumers, we have herbivores, which are your primary consumers, carnivores, which could be anything above secondary consumer, omnivores, which would be things that would eat primary consumers or any other trophic level, scavengers, decomposers. All right, food webs, and we're going to create one of these in class. We're going to create one. Shows the ecological relationships among producers, consumers, and decomposers. So this simply shows you the relationship between what's eating what, essentially. Now, this is what I was talking about with the energy relationships, the different trophic levels, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and so on. Producers are plants, anything that is autotrophic. Then you have primary consumers, which are herbivores, secondary consumers, which are eat primary consumers, and so forth. Now, if we take a look at this energy pyramid, notice what's at the base of this energy pyramid. The base of the energy pyramid is going to always be producers. Okay, it's going to always be producers because it takes more producers to in order to support what's above it. Say for instance, it takes 4 square meters rather of grass to support one mouse, and it takes 2 mice to support 1 snake. So that would mean that it would take then 8 square meters of grass to support that 1 snake. And let's say that it takes 2 snakes to support 1 hawk, as in this picture right here. Well, for each one of those snakes, it took 8 square meters of grass. So it's going to take 16 square meters of grass, excuse me, to support the hawk. So the amount of free energy decreases as we go up the pyramid. As you go from one trophic level to another, generally it's about a 10%, only 10% of the energy, free energy, moves to the next level. And so that's in general. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a hard and fast, once you reach 90%, the next 10% goes up to the next level. The next goes up to the next level. So this is just a general rule, and we call it the 10% rule. So when you have energy that's moving from one level to the next, there's a smaller amount of energy that is free as you go from one trophic level to the next. So that also means that the number of organisms in the populations as you go up the food chain is smaller and smaller. So the smallest population in any food chain is going to be the highest level consumers, typically your top level predators. So this means that the amount of energy at the producer level is 10 times greater than the amount of energy at the herbivore level, and that's 10 times greater than what you get that's right above it. Okay, so this just gives you some of that energy is lost to heat. Organisms have to use energy themselves, and so on and so forth. And so that's why you only get about 10% of usable energy that goes up the food chain. So community, habitat, and niche. We've talked about what a community is. A habitat is where living organisms, where they live. A niche is something's job in an ecosystem. So its specific role in an ecosystem. Here are your types of biomes. So remember I said earlier, if you have once you have an organism, then you have population, we have the community. Communities come together with the abiotic to form ecosystems. All of the particular ecosystems in a particular area come together to make a biome in a particular area. And so here are different types of biomes. We have land biomes, and we have water biomes. Everything that's listed here are more of our land biomes. Temperate forest, grasslands, and a lot of these are kind of subdivisions. They're usually just major ones: the tropical rainforest, the temperate forest, coniferous forest, grasslands, and then you have the three water biomes, which are saltwater, freshwater, and then where the two mix, which is called an estuary or brackish water. Here you can see the breakdown of the biomes across the earth. Obviously, in areas where you have tropical rainforest, That's where you're going to get the most biodiversity. In fact, if we take a look, here's the equator right here. The closer we are to the equator, the greater the biodiversity. The farther away you move from the equator, the less the biodiversity is. So when we think about ecosystems, we think about the cycling of matter. Energy does not cycle in an ecosystem. Energy passes through an ecosystem because it's constantly coming from the sun. You get this constant input, and then the energy is dissipated as it moves up the food chain. Matter, on the other hand, cycles within an ecosystem, where you have the carbon cycle, where you constantly have carbon. Carbon is being taken into organisms, and this has CO2, but then organisms take in carbon by eating other organisms, so that carbon is constantly moving. Plants take in carbon dioxide and convert that into sugar, which is then eaten by primary consumers, which those are then eaten by secondary consumers, and so that carbon moves up the food chain. As organisms die, that carbon is put back into the soil in some forms. As every one of those organisms goes through respiration, carbon dioxide is put back out into the atmosphere. So you have this living part of the cycle, the biotic part, where it's actually part of an organism, and then you have the abiotic part of a cycle when it's part of the atmosphere. So carbon is constantly cycling. Nitrogen is constantly cycling. We have nitrogen cycling as a result of also eating. Nitrogen can't be taken. Nitrogen is needed in all living things because we need nitrogen in our DNA. We need nitrogen in our proteins. So these are very important. We have to have nitrogen. We take in nitrogen. The atmosphere is full of nitrogen, but we can't use that because it's it's a bond that we don't have any mechanism to break. So it has to be converted into nitrates and nitrites, and that can only happen with certain plants and certain bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. So nitrogen goes into plants that way. It comes from the atmosphere, it's fixed into nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, and then it's taken up by plants. Well, once it's taken up by a plant, it can easily move up the food chain just like carbon did. Primary consumers eat the plant, secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and the nitrogen moves up that way. Well, every time something excretes, gets rid of liquid waste, you're putting nitrogen back into the environment. Every one of those organisms are putting nitrogen back into the environment. And so you end up with nitrogen going back into the environment. And so nitrogen is constantly cycling. So it moves from the atmosphere into plants, from plants into each one of the consumers, and then moves up the food chain the same way that carbon did. The water cycle. Water evaporates into the atmosphere, it condenses, and then it falls back as precipitation. So in this way, both hydrogen and oxygen are constantly being cycled as well, together as water. Plants take in water, and they use this water for photosynthesis. The first thing that happens when a plant's going through photosynthesis is that water is split apart so that they can get the electrons, and so they release oxygen, and they're also using the hydrogen ions. So they're using the electrons and the hydrogen ions from water, and then they're releasing the oxygen. So when plants release oxygen, it's not coming from CO2, it's actually coming from the water. And then they produce water at the end of cellular respiration, just like all organisms do, and so that produces water that puts water back out into the non-living part of the environment. And so water is constantly cycling as well. So how do humans affect the environment? Humans pretty much cover all of the earth, and everywhere we are, we modify it, we plow it, we dig it up, we build on it. So we're constantly changing the environment here, and we destroy habitat. And so we divert resources for humans to use. So this is a big deal, and so it's something that we need to be aware of. We're also producing a lot of CO2 by burning fossil fuels and burning wood and burning coal, which is a fossil fuel, and whatnot. So we're producing a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, which is causing climate change. We put a lot of pollutants into the environment as well. When we have things that are in a landfill, if the landfill is not done correctly, we're going to end up putting a lot of pollutants into the environment by way of having things in the landfill. We also consume a great deal. Okay, less than 20% of the population on the planet consumes about 60% of the energy on the planet. So that's a problem as well. Um, well, realistically, how are you going to get countries like the United States and China and whatnot who consume so much to slow down their consumption? That's a tough one, and it's one that we'll constantly have to work with because of the fact that humans do consume so much. Um, as with other as with each one of our other lectures I've given you here, you have study websites. If you'll take a look, and also information for the GACE for you to check out, so that you can see what it is that you're going to need to study for the GACE. If you look at the non-recorded slide deck, you will see all of these things that are there so that you can follow through, including the stages of the cell cycle. So you can take a look at that. So here are the stages of the cell cycle. This doesn't quite fit with ecology, but we'll take a look at that with the cell cycle. And chromosome replication, which is mitosis. So let's take a look at this. I'll probably make another quick video having to do with this. So we're going to end this particular lecture right now.